Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So as I was sitting here, I reached up to my version of the Supreme Being, and this force came in. So intense. Then I'm having to come back out of it, so please excuse me if I seemed a little befuddled. So we're in the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga of Devotion. Much has happened up to this point. The consciousness has matured in its own individual relationship with its inner reality, and it has, from that point, continued on, opening itself up to the universal forces that are here continuously, which most of us have no access to. And these universal forces have come in, and in the story of the Bhagavad Gita, it has been creating this passion in Arjuna, this aspiration, this longing for what it is that's coming. The power and the force of this universal divine principle that Krishna represents is being experienced directly in the feelings, in the emotions, in the body. There is no doubt at this point of the journey that these things are real, that what's happening to you is of a complete different nature than what you had experienced in the first stage of the journey. Not that people don't have glimpses of these things, glimmers and moments, where there is as much as our little wattage can absorb before it goes out. But this is of a complete different nature, because now the consciousness has gathered some density, some capacity to stay present with these, what we would call archetypal forces, that are actually governing and managing the creation continuously. But most human beings are completely sheltered from, have no clue. Even in their passage between births, they rarely transition into these domains. And this is, I think, the point of the Bhagavad Gita, is that it's only in this body, when we're in the distinctiveness of our individuality, that the full depth of the divine manifestation can be appreciated. Because this reference point, we keep coming back to the reference point of our bodily incarnation, which makes that seem even more distinct and more apparent. And this is the point. The point is the transformation of the individual into a container that can hold the universal forces and become an effective instrument or channel for these forces. So we, as I've said before, this isn't much talked about in the Western spiritual tradition, but it is the accepted recognition in the Indian Vedic tradition, and they have languaged and understood this, in my experience, with a tremendous degree of clarity and consistency. So this is the last chapter, the chapter 12, the Yoga of Devotion, is the last chapter of the second phase of the journey. And as each of the other chapters are a yoga, that means they're an engagement, an activity that occurs that takes us to union through that means, be it dejection or knowledge or action or the royal knowledge and the royal, can't remember the secret. These are all means by which the consciousness, by engaging in those experiences, becomes prepared for the next stage of the journey. So at this stage of the journey, what has happened to Arjuna is he has foolishly asked for an early vision of the universal Vishwarupa, the great experiential demonstration of the nature of the Supreme Being. And Krishna gave him the vision, took away his human vision and gave him the vision so he could see and thereby in immediate way the nature of the Supreme Being. And in this process, something in him got burned out. That trembling with fear yet ecstasy was the intensity of the transformation process he was going through, reflected in the story, in just the glimmer, just the sight. And this is how a container is prepared, by an injection of the forces bigger than the container. And it forces the container, it forces the little consciousness that has gotten habituated to this individual separative existence, even on the spiritual path, to expand, to become more capable of holding these universal forces, so that they become normal rather than extraordinary. They become more ordinary, something that can be carried, something that the person can operate with, carry with them even while they're operating in the world. This is where the Gita is going to. It's going to a state of consciousness where what was at the early stages too extraordinary for the consciousness to handle, to something it can grow used to and be more capable of holding. So everything quiets down in the 12th chapter. The end of the 11th chapter, Arjuna was overwhelmed. He said, oh my God, no, enough. Be this beautiful form with 4 arms, and even with 2 extra arms, you're still more comfortable being with than how you were before. And let me see your wonderful, gentle form. It was as much as he could handle. So Krishna withdrew. This is not that Krishna is a conscious being that withdraws. It basically, the universal force withdraws when we say enough, because it's a collaboration between the individual at this stage and the universal, and the individual has a say in this process. Now, of course, this point in the journey, once you've gone past the 7th chapter, the old human egoic consciousness cannot overtake anyone for very long. But by the time you get to the 12th chapter, there is an irresistible, day in and day out, injection of the force of the universe, intruding in what would be your normal life. So it's no longer possible to be a human being, to hang on to the old paradigm, the old way you have handled your meditations or handled your experiences or your insights or your realizations. It takes a complete different character when these much vaster universal forces are allowed to come in, but they recognize, like in a natural intelligence, that you don't push the container beyond its capacity. Although, if it's your container, you'll feel like you're being pushed beyond your capacity. The transformation process at this point is extremely intense. There's fires, there's intensity, there's no ability to be normal, to eat normally, to sleep normally, to operate normally. The intrusion of the universal forces are very strong at this point. But when they come to a certain surge and they quiet, then you're back into some new mixture of your individuality that it's been up to this point, and this new universal quality, this force that you've been introduced to and is now beginning to work in your system. Okay, let's start reading the first part of the 12th chapter.
Chapter 12, Bhakti Yoga, the Yoga of Devotion. Arjuna said, O Lord, which of the two has a higher attainment in yoga? One who is thus constantly linked with thee and worships thee with devotion, or one who worships thee as the eternal unmanifest?
Now, Arjuna at this point has returned to his ordinary, some degree of his ordinary consciousness. And he's saying, okay, I got it, so I wish to understand what is the proper relationship between me now and you, or this principle that you're demonstrating to me. What is the most effective, efficient way that I can move into relationship to this divine force that's coming in? And he's presenting two options that he is seeing. One, who is thus constantly linked with me. This constancy of linking is a state of intoxication. It is a state where there's nothing else is possible. Ramakrishna was the demonstration. He was constantly in ecstasy about God, and all he wanted to do was stay in the ecstasy. And that's the constant link. Now, the only way that can happen is if the consciousness is on the edge of merging. It's on the edge, so it's beginning from its separate position, beginning to experience the universal, non-separated condition. And it's creating these tremendous interface between the two, the individual and the universe, creates these ecstasies. But the nature of these ecstasies is the human system can't tolerate them past a point, and they'll quiet. And then they'll come back. So basically, when this was happening for me, it was just, that's exactly what it was. I was basically resting when the separation, just waiting until it would come back on again. Not being able, it's like a moth. It can't get out of the glow of the flame. Takes a break and then comes back in and sees how close it can get without getting cooked. And then it has to just back off again. Basically, this slowly roasts the moth. But it's a state of great bliss. And Ramakrishna, the great Hindu saint back at the turn of the century, Vivekananda is the disciple of, who founded the Vedanta Society, would say, I would rather taste sugar than be sugar. Because over a certain amount of time, inevitably the merger happens. And when the merger happens, all the fanfare quiets. And you become not ordinary, but you become quieter. He preferred the fanfare. He said, I'd rather taste sugar than be sugar. Because when it quiets, then you're the radiating force of the universe into your environment. And you no longer experience it yourself, but other people around you begin to experience it. And in your relationship with them, you then experience yourself. So instead of the relationship being with the divine being within your own sphere, your personal sphere, when you merge, that's when the divine starts showing up in all other forms. It creates a response in the atmosphere where other people experience their own attraction to the light that the person has become in the merger process. Well, it's my observation. When I'm in samadhi, there's no transmission going on. It's only when I'm in a more ordinary state the transmission occurs. There are other people can feel it. So people used to think, well, I'll go sit with Shree while he's in samadhi, and they would sneak in because I didn't know anything, and sit in the room with me, and then walk away and say, I didn't notice anything in particular. But they get blown out when I'm doing the talk or interacting with them in another situation where I'm more in my body. So this is one of the things that was interesting. So what's happening here is Arjuna's trying to understand. He's trying to understand what's going on and what is the best way. He's still seeking at this point. This is advanced seeking, seeking for the universal truths. And you're getting immediate experience going along with your understanding and your recognition. So is it better to worship thee with devotion, with this feeling of relationship and connection? Because in this case, Arjuna is relating to the form of Krishna, and there is clearly for him a form by which the universe is manifesting. And when a form is before a person, be it a statue or an idea or a person, the state of devotion is emphasized. The state of devotion has its basis in human feeling, human relationship. Or is it one worships thee as the eternal unmanifest, the Brahman? We've been introduced to the Brahman in the 9th chapter, in the 8th chapter, the Absolute. Or should one worship thee as the eternal, the Absolute, the impersonal? And this is when Krishna responds.
The Blessed Lord said, Arjuna, I consider them to be most devoted to me, who worship me with supreme faith, their minds ever established in me, and their consciousness fixed on me. However, those who worship me as the imperishable, unmanifest, unthinkable, all-pervading, changeless, eternal, by controlling the senses fully, always being even-minded, and devoted to the welfare of all beings, they also attain me.
So Krishna is responding to this in two parts. He's first saying, most devoted to me, who worship me with supreme faith. And what is this supreme faith? Or what is faith? Faith is the capacity to continue forward even if there's no evidence that there's anything there. It's that capacity to bridge the gap between something that you've known in the past through a period where you're no longer able to connect with that. So if in the case of devotion, these experiences come in waves, and between the waves, you're separate. And at first, this separation can be anguish. And all there is this longing, this passion for it to come back. And it's this momentum that actually eventually takes one to the place where the devotion disappears in the merger. So the faith is the part of you that knows that even though there's no evidence, the divine is there. Supreme faith means that you have direct experience, direct knowledge. When someone has had, like Arjuna has in this point, a direct glimpse in their own experience that was very real for them, then faith is much less of an issue. It's no longer hearsay. It's no longer idea. It's no longer even something that occurs only when you're in certain states, like in your meditations or your higher states. It's rather, it's always there at some level. It's always available. It's just right now quiet or behind the veil. So the supreme faith begins to disappear in a kind of trust or confidence that nothing more can be lost, that nothing can be lost, and that there is this resolute relationship with what has come. Even though the external personality might still be feeling, oh my Lord, why have you left me adrift? Why am I bereft of your presence? Why am I living in this miserable, small, ordinary state? It's only when I'm with you that I feel myself alive and true. But when you leave, I feel so less. That cry that occurs, but it's still occurring in the context of this faith, this supreme faith. Because something has come that you will never forget. It can no longer be covered over. It's irrevocable at this point. You're no longer the same. So then he goes on to those who worship me as the imperishable, unmanifest, unthinkable, all-pervading, changeless, eternal. This is the path of the sannyasi. This is the path of the renunciate, where they discover themselves as the context for the content of their life. They move into this imperishable, unchanging state of consciousness that occurs when the individual identity has fallen away, and although it's still there as content, it isn't who you are. So this is what we talked about in the 8th chapter. Experience the absolute is stepping out of the individualized human ego point of view into that which has a human individualized ego point of view. And the experience is profound, satisfying, but it's beyond words. It's beyond explanations. It's beyond labelings. It's not like something you can bring in and live in a conscious way. It's something of a complete different nature, alien, different than human. Not beyond just feeling, beyond just thought, but it includes what we might call feeling or thought in this vibrational field of the potentiality of the Absolute. This path is for those who reduce their human identification to the minimum. People who travel on this path are less likely, less motivated to come back into their human consciousness in any ordinary way. The body, the mind, the way they were are irritants. They don't want to be like this. They do it because they have to. They feed it, they put it to sleep, they go through the ordeal of being a bound, small, powerless, stupid human being. And waiting until it can pass, until they can come back out. Knowing that they are the infinity, not the finite. Knowing they are the universal, not the individual. So the Gita says, by those who control the senses fully, always being even-minded and devoted to the welfare of all beings, they also attain me. For these, we could call these people agnostics. We could call these people skeptics of the whole spiritual paradigm. People who have a natural, automatic relationship with the infinity without any fanfare. And they have come to a place in their consciousness through that particular focus that they are able to hold on to that even as they go about the actions of their day. Now, it's not to say these people tend to be, what the Gita is pointing to is the people who remove themselves from the world and pretty much says, I'm gone. And they live in that state and do not have no interest in coming back to manifest. This would be the Shiva principle. And the 3 gods that I've mentioned before, Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahman. The Shiva expression stands aloof as the Purusha, ever the witness, never allowing itself to step back down into the dance of Prakriti. It holds itself aloof from it all. While in the state of devotion, the devotion condition is different. And we'll talk about this as we continue on. The hardships for those whose minds are fixed on the unmanifest are greater. Have you read that?
No.
Oh, okay. And I'm going to let her read it.
However, the hardships for those whose minds are fixed on the unmanifest are greater because the goal to realize the unmanifest is difficult for the unbodied beings. But those who worship me as supreme by renouncing all actions to me, exclusively depending on me, and constantly meditating on me only, their consciousness ever linked with me, Arjuna, I speedily deliver them from the ocean of death and birth.
Okay. So the goal to realize the unmanifest is difficult because we as human beings are attached to our mom, our daddy, our family, our toys, our body, our comfort, the stories that we've told ourselves about who we are and what the world is. So this keeps bringing us back to our human condition. That's rare, at least certainly in this time it was more rare because the human consciousness was much more tamasic than it was now, at least in the operational plane. So the human family, especially in the Indian tradition, the family is everything. The community is everything. So it was difficult for people at that time to consider giving your life over to some vast infinity, impersonal manifestation. They much prefer rather their gods and their rituals and their worshipings. This is why Buddha came in after the Gita and said, enough of this worship, enough of these ceremonies. Let's go for nirvana. Let's go for that which is pure essence of sought truth. And then live, if you live life, you live it very from that place of the aloofness, but serving all of mankind, controlling the senses. And if you see in the Buddhist ashrams, this is the attitude. There is a detachment, a distance, a compassion. There is this willingness to serve others and serve mankind, but without anything in it for them personally. These distinctions are perhaps somewhat arbitrary, because in fact, as one gets into the state, both of these qualities become available to one. And in the process of this merging, which is occurring now the merging is really truly occurring, there is this mix of these two, this Purusha and the Prakriti, this aloof witness and this one who's still engaged in creation, but in a new relationship, not as an ordinary human being. The cord has been broken. The plant, the root has been cut. The plant is still there, but it's not motivated. It's not motivated by the same life forces that every other plant is living. Even though it's not a parent, it still looks like a human form. The origin of ego, the origin of separating, the origin of desiring, the origin of fear, of craving, of control has been cut. And all that you see running, as in a plant that's been uprooted, is what's remaining in the stem and the remaining portions of the plant until it dies out. It's already emptied. It's already cut, but it's not yet emptied. So there's this ambiguity between what you see, because in part it depends upon the nature. If someone was devotional before, when this root gets cut, they still are devotional, but the motives grow weaker and weaker. The dance becomes weaker and weaker, and their system becomes quieter and quieter. The ecstasies quiet down, and they become very authentic and natural and friendly, and this is what the Gita will reveal, this chapter will reveal, the symptoms of one who's come to this state, who is still engaged in the world in some way, still expressing out the remaining samskaras and impulses and drives that they were born with in this incarnation, and they work it out, either as a teacher or in some way serving others. Okay.
Keep me in your mind alone, and in your intellect too. Thereafter you shall dwell in me. There is nothing higher than this.
Okay. So this is just to emphasize that there is a process in this chapter is pointing to. It's called Yoga of Devotion, right? So by experiencing devotion, you're moving closer to the goal. So there's this process that's going on, and the process is what I talked about before. What Arjuna saw was just the outer limits of the radiance of the reality, the divine Visharupa. But now what's going on through the experience that's occurring in this movement towards and movement falling back and moving towards and falling back and moving towards and falling back is the vehicle, the person's capacity to be present with it increases automatically. And there is this merging process that's going on in this chapter. Through the feeling of devotion, through this feeling of aspiration or awe or wonder or terror or intense bliss and longing, there is something in the human that's being exhausted, burning out. Everything in us that has ever loved, all the loves we've ever had, everything we've striven for, everything that we've lost, everything that made up our individual identity, where the impressions were stored in the vehicle, are all being dissolved in this process, this fire. So this is the ultimate transformation of the vehicle. Transformation continues. The vehicle constantly is being tested, strengthened, expanded, as long as one continues in this journey of the Bhagavad Gita.
But if you find it difficult to be linked with me in your consciousness, then try to attain me through practice. If you are unable to pursue the path of practice, then work for me alone. You shall also attain perfection by working for me. However, while striving to realize me, if you find this to be too difficult, then by controlling your senses, relinquish the fruits of all actions to me.
So now this is the first chapter where Krishna is talking about attaining me. All the other chapters had to do with our relationship with him. Now it's about attaining. You shall dwell in me, in the previous verse. You shall try to attain me. You shall also attain this perfection by working for me. So this is again speaking. At this point now the sadhana takes on a different quality. Because one, there's more to be done. There's a way to collaborate with this intense transformation process. And according to each person's nature, one of these three ways so far introduced, through practice, through working for me, or relinquishing the fruit of action, come naturally. Some, it's a mix of all these. The practice, what is the practice? It's whatever the was before. The meditation, the ceremonies, the mantras, the techniques, the rituals, or it was by working for me. Now let's be clear about working for me. That means someone who is doing spiritual work. Specifically doing spiritual work. In my case, this was when I was specifically working for my teacher. I was a spiritual teacher at that point, but I was doing it as service for him. Everything of my life was spiritual. There wasn't anything that was individual of my old life. I was no longer practicing architecture. I was no longer balancing my checkbook. I was no longer driving a car that I owned. I no longer had any of the old actions that normally would come to someone. So I was working entirely for my teacher. And my teacher for me was the medium by which I was able to access this universal force. So my path was devotion. At this point, it was totally devotional. And the way I progressed was by serving his work. I knew it wasn't him, the ego, I was serving. It was the divine that was occupying his form. I wasn't deluded by that part. But I knew that whatever work he gave me, and he gave me work proportionally to as I developed, each stage I developed, he gave me different work. And the stage of merger, he was already given me the spiritual name. He'd already given me a center, a group of people to gather together. And I was beginning to discover what was the nature of what it is that I had become. I was becoming, I should say. And then obviously this whole other part is relinquishing the fruit of all actions to me. So if you find the practice, or if you don't have the opportunity to specifically work for the teacher, then it's whatever is available to you to do that's out of the necessity of your personal survival or your circumstances. And then you take those actions and they become the opportunity to worship the divinity. You know, your difficult child, your bad boss, things breaking down, any of these things that may be coming up become opportunities to getting off it, letting go, surrendering yourself. That this moving into relationship with the dynamic of individual life, but as now a being who's in the process of merger, everything that arises becomes an opportunity to go travel, to allow that process to go forward, to continue.
Knowledge is better than practice. Meditation is superior to knowledge, but renouncing the fruits of action is superior to meditation because peace comes instantly from renunciation.
So Gita is giving a reference point. If someone understands the nature of truth, and that means not just understand it, at this point knowledge is a direct experience. So the knowledge of the reality, the underlying reality in which Krishna is representing, is being revealed to one at this stage. That is a very powerful means by which you can do the yoga of devotion. This, however, more powerful that, this knowledge is more powerful than practice, because the nature of practice is that you're applying effort, personal effort, to do the practice. And that gets in the way of the natural revelation that's occurring at this stage. So I remember I was the person who attended all the 5 programs that occurred every single day. And it felt like it was my duty. And that in my life that has lived life dutifully was what I was doing. I was doing it as well as I could. But that practice had no value for me. It didn't help me. When I wasn't doing that practice, that's when everything was happening. When I was doing the practice, I was trying to chant, I was doing the ceremonies, I was sitting in the talks and all of this, and they were meaningless for me. They were fine, but the real things were happening when I was allowed to be alone in my room. The nature of the practice, however, is that it kept me in the grounding of the world. It kept me in my body. It kept me more in my personality. If I had stayed in my room, I would have become more and more expanded and abstract, more and more lost in the infinity of me. So it had a utility. But at this point, the yoga of devotion, it's saying that you work with what is most natural for you. So if it's more natural is the practice, then do the practice. If what's more natural to you is to allow for this state of revelation to occur, to move into the state of knowledge, to move into that contemplating on the nature of the infinity, or reading material or poetry that puts you in touch with the infinity, or just being with that within yourself, because at this point it's tangible. That's superior. Then it goes on and says, meditation is superior to knowledge. Now, what is meditation? In terms of this chapter and the yoga of devotion, meditation is when the consciousness is turned outward and turns in on itself. And what happens is when consciousness turns outward and in on itself, all the attention that comes with that consciousness, that our consciousness, is now feeding that from which attention comes from. And it creates this feedback loop. Because as we attend to that which gives attention, our ability to attend to that which gives attention expands. And it grows into this feedback loop, one building on the other. And so it's a very powerful way. This is what leads to samadhis, this absorption. And the nature of when the consciousness turns in on itself, of course, even in the early stages of meditation, are quietude and calmness and silence and peace. So it's a satisfying experience. At this point, it's more than satisfying. It's absorbing. It's like you lose yourself in the absorption of yourself. So meditation in this way is actually a more effective means of moving into the integrated merger state than practice for knowledge up to this point. But then the last one, and this is interesting, of course, this is the orientation of the Bhagavad Gita, because Arjuna is not going to come out of this, living in a cave in samadhi, right? He's going to come out to be a warrior in the middle of tremendous, intense conflict and battle and things going on, committing acts that even for an ordinary human being would be difficult. So he says superior to all of these is the renouncing the fruits of action. because peace comes instantly from renunciation. So I like to say this you can experience for yourself. When you have a situation where you're plugged into an issue, where something has come up and something in you is being activated by that issue, and you catch yourself, you find yourself, your pain body, your reaction, you find it happening in you while it's happening. And in that moment of it happening, instead of allowing the reaction or the usual way to overtake you, you choose to get off it. As soon as you choose to get off it, your authority is at its peak with whatever that issue was. That issue is, of course, our unconsciousness. We have no authority in our unconscious reactions and opinions and judgments. If we can catch ourselves in the dynamics of that part of our egoic identity and gain the authority to step off it, then the reality of what we are comes forward in that issue in such a way that a tremendous space is created. And in that space, many things could arise. It would be aliveness, a sense of a larger capacity of being would be available to you, a breaking out of whatever was the structures that set up this situation so that you can see something from a broader perspective of what was going on in you and the people around you and the circumstances. And then you're fully conscious while this is occurring. You're conscious in the surface outer personality when this occurs. And this is what Gita is trying to get us to, where we take the individual consciousness and we strengthen it so that it can be universal, where it's no longer so personal. It could be impersonal when needed, but it's also personal, also individual, as well as universal and impersonal. And this is by us coming forward as the authority in the vehicle that up to now has been running us, living us, telling us what's real and what's not real. This is the actualization. This is the integration, which actually the rest of the Gita is going to be pointing to. Okay.
One who is free from malice, is friendly and compassionate to all, is free from attachment and egoism, takes happiness and sorrow in the same light, and is forgiving in nature. Ever contented, ever linked with me, and is of firm resolve in the pursuit of yoga, one who has surrendered his mind and intellect to me, such a devotee of mine is dear to me.
So now what the Gita is doing, what Krishna is doing, is describing the symptoms of one who is engaged in the merger process. These symptoms are evidence that the merger process is occurring in you. That these attributes that are going to be described in the remaining parts of this chapter are really descriptors, measures by which you can see where you are in relationship with the world as you've known it. So if something arises where before you would get angry, I remember when this would occur. In my own merger process, I came back to the West from India and I was driving, and my nature in driving was pretty aggressive. I was a pretty aggressive driver and impatient. And I remember being stuck in the Safeway parking lot, not being able to get in traffic. It was just cars were spaced just perfect, but I just had to sit and sit and sit. And finally I just got frustrated and just slammed my foot on the gas pedal and didn't give a damn who I scared to death or ran over, and went into the traffic, and this rage or anger rose up, and it was mindless and headless, and I experienced this, and I am in this intoxicated state. There's no rage or anger. There's this huge surge of aliveness and energy and presence. Boy, was I surprised. It was completely unexpected. And so it kept showing me, it kept happening, that the old ways of being couldn't were something other than what I thought they were. The feelings of feeling oppressed or dominated by my circumstances or people around me. I would be feeling constricted and made small, or struggling not to get angry or to run away. And in that turmoil, by me attending to it and noticing it, it would break, it would shift. And suddenly, it's just a circumstance. It's just somebody working out their own issues, trying to get something to resolve it for themselves. Compassion would come, acceptance would come, forgiveness would come. And there was no conscious effort on my part. And qualities started manifesting that weren't there before in my human life. Things that I would rather, you would have to be able to manifest being ever contented. Okay? How many are ever contented? Raise your hands, right? Ever linked with me, firm resolve, who surrendered their mind and intellect. Come on. Who does not, well, we haven't gotten to those next chapters yet, but we'll go on and you'll see. The nature of what's describing here is somebody who's come into a complete, different, authentic, unquestioning relationship with existence. And these are the symptoms that they demonstrate without any effort on their part.
One who does not cause annoyance to anyone in this world, nor also feel perturbed by anybody, and is free from excitement, sorrow, fear, and anxiety. Such a person is dear to me.
Now, wouldn't it be interesting to be free from sorrow, fear, and anxiety? What would your life be like if these things didn't exist for you? How would you be with people? How would you be with things happening? Can you imagine? Try to imagine a life without fear, a life without anxiety or anticipation, without a need to plan for the future or to protect what you have. The whole relaxation that would occur when those things would fall away. This capacity to just be without the struggle and effort and existential stress. Now, it's interesting, the Gita says, free from excitement. Many people think it's good to be excited, but excitement is on the surface. Excitement exhausts itself. Excitement is what we do to distract ourselves from our condition. When something new happens, exciting happens, we want to indulge ourselves and play in that but then the excitement will always go away and we'll end up even in a more depleted state than before the excitement. Excitement is different than enthusiasm. Enthusiasm arises from the joy of the being. Enthusiasm is a spontaneous happiness that comes for some manifesting aspect of truth or oneness in your life. This joyful relationship with nature, with adventure, with discovery, with experience. But excitement is a state of agitation. It's funny how often we fall and how hard we fall when we get taken away with excitement.
He who wants nothing for himself is pure, free from laziness, impartial, has no mental divergence, who is free from the feeling of doership in all actions. Such devotee is dear to me. One who is free from attraction and repulsion, remorse and desire, who has gone beyond good and bad and has devotion to me, is dear to me. He who accepts a friend and a foe with equal feeling, honor and dishonor in equal spirit, takes heat and cold, happiness and sorrow equally, and is free from attachment, takes praise and blame alike, has attained inner silence, who remains ever happy, irrespective of what he receives, has no attachment to any place of dwelling, is stable in thought, and has devotion for me, such a person is dear to me.
Such a person is my very self. Such a person is who Krishna is. It is an attribute of one who is merged. These are attributes of someone whose individual identity has merged with their universal identity. They both coexist. Before, it was breaking out of the individual identity and beginning to know your universal identity. And here now, the two are coming together. The universal and the impersonal that comes with the universal, the stepping back and being able to see the big picture. And the personal, the individual, where it can see only the tree that is before it, the little grove that it lives in this forest of life. These two coming together. So the quality of the individual that's expressed to other people is of a different sort, where a person, instead of trying to be good or to be nice or to get along, is automatically in an authentic relationship from the place of oneness with what is happening. And they just as likely be fierce as gentle, just as likely to be rough as caring, just as likely to be indifferent as well as compassionate or involved. That the system is no longer limited by one cluster of the dualities or another. They're all become available to the person according to the situation that they're reacting to or that's come up for them to deal with. So this is pointing to something very important that will be emphasized as we go further into the remaining 6 chapters of the Gita.
And Arjuna, those devotees who honor this nectar-like, imperishable law, as explained above, with faith and devotion, and are linked with me, are exceedingly dear to me. Thus ends the 12th chapter of Gita, entitled the Yoga of Devotion.
So what has happened is exceedingly dear to me means that this soul that Arjuna represents is now a manifestation of what Krishna is. Arjuna is becoming Krishna. This is the transformation of Arjuna, the transformation of the individual being into the divine being. And of course, there is a dynamics. There is a relationship that exists from the individual point of view to the universal. And from the universal point of view, it's all one. There is not relationship in the way we understand relationship. It's everything is itself. But for the individual, the experience is that divine is your intimate companion, an intimate part of you, a deep and profound relationship that is as intimate as any relationship you could imagine as human beings. So God is right there, always there. You surrendered yourself. You don't even have to think about surrendering yourself because you are now becoming it. Surrender actually starts occurring after we get off it enough, after we let go enough, after we forgive enough, after we come to acceptance, we come to some terms with the things in life that we don't want. And then there comes this intimacy with those things. We begin to know them. We begin to feel the relationship to all the parts of ourselves and others that up to now we were not able to be in relationship with. So this is the state of oneness. This is this condition of universal love, where there is no sense of separation. And then how you act and how you demonstrate, coming from a state of connection rather than the ego's place of separation, is of a complete different quality. And that is what this chapter is pointing to. So when you look at this chapter and you look at how you are in these areas, to see, that gives you some idea. Maybe you have half of these qualities. Maybe you have a quarter of these qualities. Maybe you have 75% of these qualities. So that gives you some clue into the nature of your relationship with the divinity that you are. You may have these without even knowing. You may be in the yoga of devotion without even knowing you're in the yoga of devotion. That's the point. Some people don't even know they're operating from the state of merger until they read these lists of symptoms and say, oh, I do that. Yeah, that's me. That's me. Of course, then you have to test it. And you have to be honest with yourself when you're out in the world and say, oh, nope, not today. I'm not treating everybody equally today. Or I'm finding myself really invested in having things be different than they are. So it's a good measuring point to find out where you are. Now what's going to happen now, we're entering into the next stage of the Bhagavad Gita. This is not that devotion is complete, not that the yoga of devotion is complete, not that the yoga of the universal vision is complete, not that the yoga of all the previous chapters are complete. They all may still be going on to some extent. As we encounter different parts of our multiple selves that are different stages of development. But by this point now, the consensus of all our multiple selves is much more greatly aligned with our divine nature. And what's going to happen now is you are a different kind of creature on the planet. You have a complete different order than what had existed before, relative for your capacity for experience and knowing. That you're feeling in yourself the force of the manifesting force of the creation, and it's becoming yours. It's as if a sanction is coming, a confidence is coming about the nature of how you are and how existence is and how everyone else is. This is the state that the next chapters will be describing and revealing some of the characteristics. Each of these chapters are in themselves a continuing of the same yoga, the same process that takes us to the supreme state of consciousness. So it's not over yet, guys. If you thought this was too impossible to comprehend in your own experience, all I can tell you is it's not over yet. When I came to the 12th chapter, that was as far as I could go. What was starting to occur in these next chapters for years, I couldn't get. I wanted to get it. I wish I could get it, or I would get bits and pieces of it. But it's not until later that each chapter reached their maturity and the revelation that was pointed to in the 13th and the 14th and the 15th chapter became more and more palatable and tangible for me. Okay. So that's it for today's revelation on the Bhagavad Gita. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.